Thank you again. Eric Ringelberg for local agencies in North Delta. So I identified in the definitions what I considered some of the challenges with RRP3 and RRP4. But most specifically, I'll illustrate that we feel since the Central Valley Flood Protection Board already has authority over this, that this particular regulation would be unnecessarily and unduly duplicative of the original with an existing state agency. At a finer detail, looking specifically at the terms here, because no encroachment essentially means any sort of impact, positive, negative, within the floodway, the way it's been described in the definitions, and that it can't unduly impede the free flow of water, there's no definition to live with there. So under FEMA, we have a 1 foot range, has to be within a 1 foot range. And that's something that's clear, that's something that's easily modeled with existing software. But it's difficult to say how we would be able to identify what the unduly impedance of free flow of water would be in this circumstance. We need some more carefully articulated distinction here to get to, I think, what the important point is, which is you don't want to jeopardize human health and safety with these flow impediments. Not prescribed against positive things that could improve flow or things that improve habitat. Okay. And one thing that I did, staff and I spoke at some length about this, there's an idea that this regulation sunsets, and the way it's described, it infers a sunset. If the Central Valley Flood Protection Board asserts its authority in a way that the council feels meets this term. What I'd like to see is a clear sunset provision identifying when that case is so that we don't have this duplication of authorities.
Well, I mean, the problem is that we have concurrent authority in a portion of the statutory delta with the Central Valley Flood Board. And although you may be correct that they're asserting jurisdiction over areas outside their territory, I've never heard them say that. But let's assume for argument that they are correct. They certainly would love to see standardized rules for areas within their jurisdiction and adjacent areas. But you want us to essentially say if we're going to do an ugly thing like accept the definition and language suggested by the Flood Board when they refuse to accept your version, preferred version to the language, we should sunset that. We should sunset our incorporation of their language. That's what I thought you were going to say. That's what I thought you were saying. Am I wrong?
Maybe I can clarify here. So
okay.
What I perceive are really two overlapping areas of coverage. There's statutory authority given to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to do this exact same activity, this kind of regulation. The perception is that they are not meeting that in certain areas within the Delta. They very clearly articulate and express in their maps and readily available on their website designated floodways and regulated streams. And within the Delta, the vast majority of them are regulated streams. It covers all the sloughs that I'm aware of. The only areas of coverage that I'm unaware of would be certain small cuts, areas that basically are unnamed sections between reclamation districts in the Delta. And so it gives the appearance to me that they already have full and complete authority over there under the regulated streams portion, not necessarily under the floodway.
A couple of points of clarification I think would be worth remarking on. One is that Mr. Engelberg's assertion that this would allow no encroachment is not correct. This allows no encroachment that would have a significant adverse effect. So many kinds of encroachments are not going to have a significant effect, and my understanding is the term unduly impair is exact language that's used in the Flood Board's rules today. It's a rule that engineers have been meeting in this valley for many decades, and I don't think it's an uncertain term at all. And as to the extent of the Reclamation Board's or the Flood Board's jurisdiction, we've defined regulated streams as being any area where they do have jurisdictions. It's streams that meet their definition. I'm not aware that they're actually asserting control over the channels in the Delta other than the ones that have been mapped pursuant to that rule, which are typically on the west side of the Yolo bypass. But in any place where the Reclamation Board has a regulatory jurisdiction, and they would say so underneath their rules for regulated streams or designated floodways, our definitions would relieve a local entity or any other entity from needing to file a certificate of consistency in those areas.
Okay.
Yeah, I beg to differ with Dan's assertion. In the plain language of this, it says no encroachment shall be allowed or constructed in a floodway unless it can be demonstrated by appropriate analysis. Please help us understand what that appropriate analysis is for the purposes of your purview. That's an important issue for us. I mean, Dan asserts that it's widely held. There are a lot of things that are widely held that don't meet scrutiny of law, and certainly the pattern and practice has a wide variation. And so I want to make sure that if we're going to be held to that, if we're going to be up here defending ourselves for a covered action, that we can point to the fact that we are either consistent or inconsistent with this. And the way it's written...
Did you make a distinction between the rules of the Central Valley Flood Board and their pattern and practice, which are different? Did I hear that correctly? If any agency, ourselves, anybody else, operates differently from the rules, how can we control that unless we investigate their activities day by day? I mean, what do you want us to do?
I'm not the one urging that we subsume the language of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board.
No, I do understand that. You don't support staff recommendations. I got that.
Okay.
Okay.
So to clarify, if the staff indeed feels that there are areas of the Delta that are not covered by this, it would be useful to know what those areas are, for one. Two, and I think it would be extremely helpful for us to have some specific language so that when we come in front of this body with an appeal, that we can point to whether or not we're consistent or inconsistent.
Yeah, you might want to take a look at the past meetings where we went through this discussion about Central Valley Flood Board, Plains, legal authority, jurisdiction. There were maps provided. I must confess that I don't remember the precise meeting dates or dates where that happened, but I think the record's pretty clear on where the boundaries of the boundaries are statutory to begin with.
Right.
The boundaries of the Central Valley Flood Board exist. I don't know. Mr. Ray?
The Delta Plan itself has an exhibit which depicts both the regulated streams and the boundaries of the designated byways that are in the Central Valley floodplains.
And its number, the map is titled or whatever?
It's Appendix M.
M?
Yes.
M.
Yes, and we've looked at that, and it points to the fact that the regulated streams are very clearly almost every water body that we can identify within the legal Delta.
Well, in that case, then you would go to the flood as the definitions and the provisions of 5,000 and whatever it is.
The regulatory provisions?
Yeah, the regulatory provisions make clear. Then you would go to them and not us. If it's not regulated, you come to us.
Okay. Mr. Natoli.
Yeah. Go back to the point Eric made a moment ago about kind of generally acknowledged or widely acknowledged. So is it displacement or obstructions or combination? I mean, is it all those things? I mean, typically the way I've understood with floodplain encroachment that you can put something in there, but it's displacement that, and whether it's by placing a structure in there, fill, other types of activities, and that, going to the point about, we put woody material in or might be penalized for plantings, I say obstructions, but there's things that, hold up the flow of the water. Those are the generally applicable, generally acknowledged, or are there other things that go into
I think I would refer to our engineering staff. Again, we've been relying on language that's been used by the Central Valley Flood Board for a long time, and my understanding is that folks have been complying with rules comparable to this, certainly comparable to the one that protects bypasses and regulated streams.
But I just wonder about the analysis we require. To his point, I mean, that was the bottom line, is what sort of analysis we have to show. I don't know what the Flood Protection Board requires as far as their analysis, but I can imagine displacement, that can be pretty significant engineering based upon volumes of water and all those things. And then likewise with obstruction, I don't know if you have a major river or slough, they have different flows and tidal actions and everything else.
Yeah, if I could just maybe add. So we've worked with the flood board staff when we were thinking through this language and asking exactly the same questions. To what level does an appropriate analysis rise to? And they don't have a very well-published scheme that you would follow. They have some rules of thumb. They've worked with the Corps of Engineers. So, for example, if you're going to put something in that may not obstruct the channel width more than 1%, then it doesn't fall into their purview. And I think they've worked with the Corps on trying to come up with some decision tree processes on that. But what the flood board typically does, they encourage folks to approach them early, consult with them, describe the project, and then they can start to understand the size of the analyses that may be required. So if it's something simple like putting in a signpost or something, obviously that's not going to rise to the level of a full-blown hydraulic analysis. But if you're talking about a substantial structure on the water side, then that may require more of a full analysis. And so I think that's why we were a bit careful to parrot the language that the flood board currently has in Title 23 about unduly impeding the free flow of water by an appropriate, unless it can be shown by an appropriate analysis. That's not being done, and then we would probably try to work with our partners at the flood board to ensure that the same types of analyses are being developed to show consistency.
So we would pattern you've just much said so, pattern ourselves up to the flood board, but this early consult, again, so that, again, as Eric said, if they have to end up arguing before this board on some sort of an appeal, that they've done the appropriate analysis. So are we going to encourage the early consult then with us if, in fact, we are one of the entities is going to have
Sure. Well, and again, though, realizing that we're not a permitting authority in this case, and I would defer to Mr. Stevens to make sure I don't misspeak, but the project proponent would file consistency. They would go through whoever the approving agency is in order to get approval to do whatever the activity is, and then they would file consistency. And then if somebody has concerns that they feel, well, this is a covered action and it rises to the level of concern that they did not conduct an appropriate analysis, then I think we would probably want to work with our partners at DWR and the flood board to better understand what would constitute an appropriate analysis. But again, we're not a step in the route to get a permit, or we're not a step in the process to demonstrate what is an appropriate analysis on a project-by-project basis.
But you might be a side step on a consistency hearing, though.
Yeah. But certainly the rules that we've already adopted encourage early consultations where folks think they might, with us, when folks think they might have a covered action. So we'll always be available to meet with people if they have questions, what kind of analysis might work, and we probably would sit down with our partners who also have an interest in these issues.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. And actually, did you want to discuss RRP4?
No, because we're going to do them one at a time. Thank you very much.